Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the Azure App Service and some related functionality that I think is really important on the platform as a service. So we need to make a distinction between the other services and App Service. App Service specifically is made up of 4 components. There's web apps, mobile apps, logic apps, and API apps. Those 4 things. And then we're going to plus them up with things like notification hubs and API management, and talk about some really interesting things that surround them. But the Azure App Service is such a powerful idea. You get all 4 of these with one kind of purchase in Azure, if you would, and you can run your web apps, mobile apps, logic apps, and API apps and scale them all up together or independently as desired. Now, when we start talking these things, there's a few benefits. And I'd ask you just to take a quick look at the slides so you can see things like auto patching and auto scale. You can write across any language you want, .NET, Node, PHP, Python, Ruby, you name it. You can integrate with the software as a service and on-premise things, and we can build all of these things with continuous integration. I'm a giant fan of team services and VSTS, but you might be using GitHub or Bitbucket, and those work just fine as well. Now, we're going to hit all of these, plus mix in some of those other frameworks, but first we're going to start off with web apps. Now, Colin, what's the best way you have to learn web apps? How would you introduce web apps?
Well, instead of boring you with slides, Steve, I'm going to jump straight into a demo so you can see how cool web apps are by seeing them in action.
In this demo, I'm going to show you how we can take a file new project and host it in Azure Web Apps. This isn't the only way you can get code into Azure, and in fact, .NET's not the only language you can host in an Azure Web App. We'll start by going to File, New Project, and selecting the ASP.NET Web Application. I'll call this CD Demo Azure Web App and click OK. We'll select MVC from the project templates, and then in the bottom right there's a Microsoft Azure section where we're telling the wizard that we want to host this as an app service in Microsoft Azure. If we select that, we'll be asked where to create the app service. I'll take away the date component from the default name. The wizard will check if that name is available. And I'll select a subscription and a resource group and a service plan. I could also use the new buttons here to create a new resource group or a new service plan if I wanted to. The service plan specifies what scale units we're using to host our application. We'll see how we can tweak that once the app is created. I'll click Create, and Visual Studio will go and create that app service for me in the Azure resource group. Let's quickly switch over to the portal to see what that Azure Web App looks like. I'll refresh the resources in the resource group, and you can see the CD Demo Azure Web App has been created. Let's click on that to see the overview page. The overview page is going to give me the URL where I can access that web application. You can see that it's been created successfully, although there's no code there yet. We can also see what app plan we're on, and we can stop the web app if we need to. Let's go back to Visual Studio and push some code out. I'm going to right-click on the project and select Publish, and you'll see that the information I need to push my code from Visual Studio to the web app is already populated for me. Let's go back to the profile and select Azure App Service so you can see these settings. If I expand my resource group, you'll see the web app that we just created when we did File New Project. We can also deploy to deployment slots. We haven't created any yet, and we'll see them on the portal shortly. For now, we're just going to publish to the production slot of the web app. I'll hit Publish, and it'll take a few seconds to push my code up to the web app. The publish has completed successfully. Let's switch back to the portal to have a look at our web app. We'll go to the Web App tab, and I'll hit Refresh. And you see we now have the File New Project. Let's click on the About page, and it works. Of course, this isn't a demonstration of what code you can put up there, just a demonstration of how you can get code to an Azure Web App. Let's go back to the portal and see what else we can manage on an Azure Web App. Now I showed you how to publish code from within Visual Studio. Of course, we could use the FTP settings here to deploy code from FTP. We could also set up continuous delivery via VSTS by clicking on the continuous delivery blade. This will walk us through setting up a team project with a build and a release pipeline, so you don't even have to create it yourself. Let's go up to deployment slots and create a dev deployment slot. I'll click add slot and we'll create a dev slot. If we click on the dev slot once it's been created, you'll see that it looks just like the web app. It has its own settings, its own deployment, configuration, and even its own URL. Again, I'll click on that to open it up in a new tab. You can see how the URL has a -dev suffix in the name to distinguish it from the production slot. Now that we've created a dev slot, not only can we deploy to that slot, but we can also do what's called testing in production. Let's go back to our web app. And if we scroll down in the settings, under development tools, we'll see a blade called testing in production. Let's say we've deployed a new version of our application out to our dev slot. We can do some A/B testing by selecting the dev slot and routing 5% of all the traffic to that particular slot. Now when users hit the URL of the production site, 1 out of every 20 requests will be routed to the dev slot. This will allow us to do some A/B testing before rolling out the new version of our application. If I click on application settings, here's where I would come to specify general settings on the web app, as well as things like app settings and connection strings. You can see there's configuration settings for authentication and authorization, for custom domains and certificates. What I did want to dive into is scaling up. If you wanted to scale up the application, you could scale up the plan to give more RAM and more CPUs to the web app. However, we can also scale out the web app, giving it more instances. For example, we could bump it up to 4 instances if we feel that is going to be enough instances for our needs. We can also set some auto-scaling rules. In this drop-down, I'm going to select CPU percentage, and we'll specify that we want the app to maintain between 3 and 6 instances, and we want the CPU threshold to be between 40% and 80%. In other words, when the CPU goes below 40, we're instructing Azure to drop an instance down till the point where we only have 3 instances. If CPU goes over and above 80%, we want to bump up instances until we reach a maximum of 6 instances. You can see we can also send out emails every time Azure auto scales up or down. In the Web Jobs blade, we can specify batch jobs to run using the same resources as our application. This is great for offline processing and can be as simple as a command line exe. Coming further down to the API section, you can see that there are CORS settings here, which we can specify if we need to. There's also a monitoring section where we can link into application insights, view diagnostic logs and log streams, and see other metrics. This has given you a brief flavor for what you can do with Azure Web Apps.